In the aftermath of the First Contact War, a fragile peace had been brokered between humanity and the Zarathians, an alien species known for their disciplined, military culture and unwavering sense of honor. To foster understanding between the two species, the Intergalactic Peace Council arranged a series of cultural exchange programs. One such initiative was the invitation for Commander Vex'thor, a decorated Zarathian military leader, to tour Earth's most prestigious military academy, the United Earth Defense Academy, UEDA. Arrival at the academy. Commander Torek arrived at the academy in his ceremonial armor, his 4 eyes scanning the sprawling campus with curiosity. He was greeted by General Helena Carter, the academy's head, who extended a warm hand of welcome. "Welcome, Commander Torek," she said with a practiced smile. "We're honored to show you how humanity prepares its defenders." Torek inclined his head, his voice a low rumble. "I am eager to witness the strength of your warriors. Let us begin the tour." The first stop was the Academy's Hall of Heroes, where the walls were lined with holograms of decorated soldiers. Torek studied the images, impressed by their valor, but disturbed by the grim expressions and sheer number of lives lost. "Your warriors fight with great courage," he noted. "But your wars seem excessive." General Carter's smile faltered. "Human history has been turbulent, but each conflict has made us stronger." Next, they visited the training grounds. Torek watched as cadets sparred in hand-to-hand combat, their movements aggressive and brutal. The Zarathian commander was taken aback by the sheer ferocity. Zarathian combat focused on disabling enemies with precision, valuing life even in war. Here, it seemed humanity trained its soldiers to annihilate. "Why do they fight with such rage?" Torek asked. "To ensure victory," Carter replied. "We teach them to channel their emotions into strength." Torek's mandibles twitched in discomfort. Emotion clouds judgment. It leads to unnecessary destruction. The simulated battlefield. The tour's climax was a demonstration of Earth's latest military technology, a simulated battlefield where cadets practiced urban warfare. Torek observed as teams of cadets stormed a mock city, their weapons blazing. Civilian dummies were scattered throughout the arena, and while some cadets carefully avoided them, others disregarded the collateral damage. Torek's 4 eyes widened in shock. "You trained them to kill indiscriminately?" General Carter stiffened. "War is messy, Commander. We prepare our soldiers for the realities of combat." Torek's voice rose, his usual composure slipping. "The realities you prepare them for are atrocities. War should be a last resort, fought with honor and restraint. This is savagery. The final confrontation." At the end of the tour, Torek stood before the Academy's leadership, his towering frame radiating disapproval. "Your species is dangerous," he declared. "Not because of your strength, but because of your lack of discipline. You glorify destruction and teach your young to revel in it. This is not the way of honorable warriors." General Carter bristled. "We do what we must to survive, Commander. Humanity has faced extinction more times than we can count. Perhaps your species wouldn't understand." Torek's voice softened, tinged with sorrow. "Perhaps we do, but we chose a different path, a path that values life, even in war. If you do not change, humanity's greatest threat will not come from the stars. It will come from within." Chapter 1: Arrival. The sleek, obsidian craft descended through the atmosphere with a grace that belied its enormous size. To the untrained eye, it resembled a shard of midnight slicing through the sky, its surface shimmering faintly as it passed through Earth's gravity well. On the ground below, a crowd of human dignitaries, soldiers, and cadets waited in formation, their uniforms crisp, their expressions a mix of awe and apprehension. Standing at the forefront of the welcoming party was General Laura Hastings, the commanding officer of the prestigious Westwood Military Academy. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the craft as it landed with a gentle hiss, its landing gear extending with mechanical precision. Beside her, Cadet Ethan Voss shifted nervously, his hand brushing against the ceremonial saber at his side. "Relax, Voss," Hastings muttered without turning her head. "This is a diplomatic visit, not a battlefield." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, though his grip on the saber tightened. A ramp extended from the alien ship, and a figure emerged. Commander Vex'thor of the Zircon Dominion was imposing even by his own species standards. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, his elongated, angular frame was sheathed in a flowing, iridescent uniform that seemed to shift colors with every movement. His face was a masterpiece of alien biology. Sharp, crystalline features framed by bioluminescent filaments that pulsed gently in the Earth's sunlight. The crowd's murmurs died as Vex'thor descended the ramp, his 4 eyes scanning the humans before him. He paused at the base, his gaze locking onto General Hastings. "General Hastings," he said, his voice resonating with a deep melodic timbre. "I thank you for welcoming me to your world. The Zircon Dominion values this exchange of knowledge and culture." "The honor is ours, Commander Vex'thor," Hastings replied, extending a hand. After a brief hesitation, Vex'thor clasped it with one of his elongated digits, the gesture a carefully studied approximation of a human handshake. As formalities concluded, the group moved toward the Academy's main hall. Cadet Voss couldn't help but glance back at the alien craft, a shiver running down his spine. He'd grown up hearing stories of the Zircon-Human War, a conflict that had ended in a fragile truce only a decade ago. This visit was meant to symbolize a new era of cooperation, but for many, old wounds still lingered. Chapter 2: The Tour. The interior of Westwood Military Academy was a blend of tradition and cutting-edge technology. Marble floors and towering columns spoke of its storied history, while holographic displays and advanced training simulators hinted at its commitment to the future. As the group moved through the corridors, Vex'thor's eyes absorbed every detail, his expression inscrutable. "This facility has trained some of Earth's finest soldiers," Hastings explained, her tone measured. "From tactical strategy to hand-to-hand combat, our cadets are prepared for any scenario." Vex'thor paused before a display case containing medals and photographs of past graduates. His gaze lingered on a black-and-white photo of a young soldier, his face stern, his uniform adorned with commendations. "This one," Vex'thor said, pointing a slender finger. "Who was he?" Hastings followed his gaze. "Captain Marcus Kane, a hero of the Second Martian conflict. He led a successful defense against overwhelming odds, ensuring the survival of thousands." "And yet," Vex'thor murmured, "he was a killer." The room fell silent. Hastings stiffened, her jaw tightening. "He was a soldier, Commander. He did what was necessary to protect his people." Vex'thor's bioluminescent filaments dimmed briefly, a gesture akin to a human sigh. "Perhaps. But necessity does not absolve the taking of life." The tension was palpable as the tour continued. In the combat training hall, cadets demonstrated their skills against holographic opponents. Vex'thor observed with keen interest, his 4 eyes tracking every movement. When a cadet executed a particularly brutal takedown, he turned to Hastings. "Your methods are efficient," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "But they are unrelenting." "War is not a place for mercy, Commander," Hastings replied. "Our enemies won't show it, and neither can we." Vex'thor's filaments flared brightly, a rare display of emotion. "And yet it is this unrelenting nature that perpetuates conflict. I came here to learn, General, but what I see fills me with dread." Before Hastings could respond, Vex'thor turned and strode toward the exit. Cadet Voss, who had been silently trailing the group, exchanged a glance with Hastings, whose expression was a mix of frustration and concern. As the alien commander disappeared down the corridor, Hastings muttered under her breath, "This is going to be a long visit." Chapter 3. The tour begins. The alien commander, Zorith, stood in the shadow of the towering human military academy. His metallic skin shimmered under the sun, and his glowing blue eyes scanned the facility with an air of cold detachment. He had seen many planets, many species, but nothing had prepared him for the humbling experience that awaited him here. He was escorted by General Harkwell, a seasoned human officer who had worked tirelessly to build the reputation of the Academy. "This is where the best of humanity trains," Harkwell said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Our soldiers are the backbone of our defense, and we prepare them for everything." Zorith nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He had seen military academies before, but this one was different. The humans seemed almost too eager. They were so young, yet their eyes held a depth of knowledge and determination that unsettled him. As they walked through the halls, Zorith's eyes lingered on the students. Their faces were a mix of fear, excitement, and an unsettling thirst for combat. He had heard rumors of human aggression, but seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. "These students," Zorith began, his voice low and calculating, "they train for war as if it is a game. But war is no game." General Harkwell chuckled. "You'd be surprised how much fun they have. It builds camaraderie and toughness. We teach them to think on their feet, to adapt and to survive. The battlefield is unforgiving, but they learn quickly." Zorith's eyes narrowed. He could sense something darker beneath the surface. As they entered a training room, he was greeted with the sight of young soldiers sparring with one another. The intensity of their movements, the speed, the precision, it was all too much. These were not the students of a typical military academy. They were predators in training. Chapter 4. The Horrifying Revelation. As the tour continued, Zorith's unease grew. He was shown the simulation rooms where students engaged in virtual combat, the firing ranges where they honed their skills, and the classrooms where they learned about strategy and tactics. But it was the final stop that truly shook him to his core. They entered a large chamber, and the door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Inside, a group of cadets stood in formation, awaiting their next instructor. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the artificial lights. General Harkwell turned to Zorith, his face serious. "This is the final stage of training. Here, the students face their greatest challenge." Zorith raised an eyebrow. "And what challenge would that be?" Without a word, Harkwell gestured for the cadets to step forward. The students, all around the age of 18, began to move in perfect unison. They were armed with rifles, their faces masked with an expression of cold determination. Zorith watched, captivated by their precision. But it wasn't until they began to speak that the true horror revealed itself. "Commander Zorith," one of the cadets said, his voice calm and almost robotic. "You are our target." Zorith froze. His mind raced as the cadets moved closer, their weapons aimed at him. General Harkwell stood by, watching without a hint of concern. "What is this?" Zorith demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. Harkwell finally spoke, his voice cold and emotionless. "This is the final test. They are trained to neutralize any threat, regardless of who or what it is. You, Commander, are the perfect subject for their final exercise." Zorith felt a chill run down his spine. These humans, these young soldiers, had been trained to view him as nothing more than a target. They were not afraid of him. They were not in awe of his alien nature. They were eager to destroy him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The humans were not just preparing for war. They were preparing to exterminate anything they saw as a threat, without hesitation, without mercy. And in their eyes, he was no different than any other enemy. He could feel his heart race, his mind scrambling for an escape, but there was no way out. The students closed in, their movements precise and coordinated. Zorith's mind flashed back to the stories of human brutality, stories he had once dismissed as exaggerated propaganda. But now, standing in the heart of their training ground, he understood. The humans were not just preparing for war. They were preparing for a war of annihilation. Chapter 5. The Silent Halls. Commander Zoratha's boots echoed on the cold, metallic floors of the human military academy. He had been given a guided tour by one of the academy's senior officers, Colonel Jackson, who had tried to maintain an air of professionalism despite the commander's growing unease. Zorath had seen many civilizations in his travels across the galaxy, but nothing prepared him for the brutality that seemed to seep from every corner of this human institution. The walls of the academy were lined with posters depicting combat strategies, images of young soldiers in training, and slogans that spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice. "Here, Commander," Colonel Jackson said, gesturing to a training room. "This is where we prepare our cadets for the battlefield. We focus on mental and physical toughness. We don't coddle them." Zoratha's eyes narrowed as he watched a group of young humans sparring in the center of the room. The sound of fists striking flesh was unsettling, but it wasn't the violence that disturbed him most. It was the fervor in the cadets' eyes. They fought not just for survival, but for something far more dangerous: pride. As the training session ended, the cadets lined up to receive their evaluations. Zoratha's gaze lingered on one young soldier, a female cadet with a fierce expression, who had been particularly brutal in her sparring. She was sweating, her face bruised, but there was no sign of remorse in her eyes. She stood tall, proud of her actions. Colonel Jackson noticed Zoratha's discomfort. "They're taught to be resilient," he said, "to never show weakness, to always be prepared for the worst. That's the human way." Zorath could barely comprehend the mentality. To train young minds in such a way, to harden them so early, it was a form of cruelty in itself. But as he moved through the academy, he began to realize that this was not just a training ground for soldiers. It was a factory for vengeance. Chapter 6. The Dark History. Later, Zorath was taken to a museum within the academy, a vast hall filled with relics of humanity's past wars. As he stepped inside, the walls seemed to close in on him. The air was thick with the weight of history, and the commander could feel a strange, unsettling energy in the room. "This is our history," Colonel Jackson explained, his voice almost reverent. "Every conflict we've fought, every battle we've won, and every life we've lost. We don't forget. We remember. And we never stop preparing for the next fight." Zoratha's eyes scanned the exhibits: old weapons, uniforms, medals, and propaganda posters. But what caught his attention most were the images of the human wars, the brutal endless cycles of revenge and retribution that seemed to define their existence. The more he looked, the more the patterns emerged. Wars fought not for survival, but for the sake of revenge. The desire to right perceived wrongs, to punish those who had wronged them, to prove their superiority. One display caught his eye in particular. It was a large mural depicting a battle from humanity's past, a violent conflict that had nearly wiped out an entire civilization. The caption beneath it read, "The Great Reckoning." It was a moment in human history when they had fought back against an alien race, driven by a desire for vengeance after a brutal invasion. Zorath felt his stomach churn. He had heard of this conflict before, but seeing it portrayed so vividly brought a new level of horror. The humans had not just fought to protect themselves, they had fought with a burning need to make their enemies suffer, to exact a toll far greater than the harm they had endured. "This is what drives us," Colonel Jackson said, his voice filled with pride. "We never forget our enemies. We never forgive. And we always make them pay." Zoratha's heart sank. The humans were not simply preparing for war. They were preparing for a cycle of endless retribution. This was a race that had learned to fight not just for survival, but for a twisted sense of justice, and that made them more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. As the tour ended, Zorath stood in silence, his mind racing. The Academy had shown him the true nature of humanity's military might, and it was far darker than he could have ever imagined. He had come here to observe, to understand, but what he had witnessed had shaken him to his core. The humans were not just preparing for the next battle, they were preparing for a war that would never end. Chapter 7. The Unseen Truth. Commander Zarnak's footsteps echoed through the pristine halls of the human military academy. His sharp, angular features seemed to soften with every passing moment as he absorbed the chaotic energy of the human students. The academy was a hive of activity, filled with young soldiers training relentlessly, perfecting their combat techniques, and preparing for a war that had yet to come. Zarnak had initially been curious, eager to understand how these primitive beings could challenge the might of his fleet. But as he observed the grueling training sessions, his curiosity began to turn into something darker. The human soldiers were relentless, pushing their bodies to the brink of exhaustion, and yet they never stopped. He watched as cadets were forced to undergo simulated battles, some collapsing from fatigue, only to be dragged back up and thrust into the fray once again. The brutality of their training was unlike anything Zarnak had ever seen. The humans didn't just train for victory, they trained for survival. Every drill, every maneuver, was a battle for life itself. Zarnak's mind raced. Was this the key to their resilience? Was this why they were willing to fight to the death, even against overwhelming odds? He had never understood it before, but now he was beginning to glimpse the answer. In one of the training halls, a cadet fell to the ground, unable to continue. His fellow soldiers didn't hesitate. They immediately dragged him away and replaced him with another. Zarnak's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about strength. This was about a willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause. The human resolve was unnerving. Zarnak turned away from the scene, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His mind was no longer on the battle tactics or strategies he had come to observe. He was haunted by something far deeper, the human capacity for endurance, for suffering, for revenge. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. Zarnak's tour of the academy had taken him to the combat simulation chamber, where cadets engaged in brutal mock battles against advanced AI-controlled enemies. As the simulations played out, Zarnak's unease grew. The humans weren't just fighting, they were fighting with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep within their souls. One simulation was particularly disturbing. A group of cadets was tasked with defending a strategic position against an overwhelming force. The simulation was designed to test their ability to withstand an enemy assault. But as the battle raged on, Zarnak noticed something that made his stomach churn. The cadets were not just defending, they were actively seeking out the most vicious ways to destroy the enemy. Zarnak's eyes widened as one cadet used a flamethrower to incinerate a group of simulated enemies, their digital screams echoing in the chamber. Another cadet used explosives to tear apart the opposition, their faces twisted in a mix of concentration and hatred. The simulation was supposed to be a test of strategy, but Zarnak saw it as something much darker, a reflection of the human spirit, a thirst for vengeance that ran deeper than any alien commander could comprehend. He turned away, his heart racing. The humans didn't just fight for victory, they fought for retribution. Every strike, every blow, seemed to be driven by a need to pay back the suffering they had endured. This was not a war for conquest or glory. This was a war of vengeance. Zarnak's mind flashed back to the war between their two species, the years of suffering his people had inflicted upon the humans. He had thought it was a simple matter of superiority, of asserting dominance. But now, as he watched the cadets fight, he understood. The humans weren't fighting for survival. They were fighting for revenge. And in that moment, Zarnak realized something that chilled him to his core. The humans had been preparing for this war long before the first shot was fired.